Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon. I have a dream today. Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
Okay, so this was the first crisis, okay? The first crisis that we went through after Trump was chosen as president of the United States and sworn in was the Michael Flynn crisis. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2017, Donald Trump and his advisors were in the Oval Office. I'm reading the New York Times article, by the way, and we're going to play the audio from the relevant times, okay? So that you can, because you've heard all these clips. We've all heard these clips because I have them, and we save them. And we save them so that when all the threads are pulled together and wrapped into a spool, you can go back and listen to them again and understand what was being said, because so much of it was classified and so much of it couldn't be said out loud. So much of it was said in private. So much of it was said behind closed doors. And you know what the sick thing is? Devin Nunes and Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and Paul Ryan, all these people in the House on the Intelligence Committee and the Speaker of the House, they all knew this. That's the most disgusting part, is they all knew. And they did nothing. In fact, they did something, and that was they investigated the investigators. They denigrated the investigators. They humiliated the investigators. When the investigators were producing actual tape-recorded conversations, they said they're having an affair and they're lovers. Therefore, the tapes are not true. And this was played on an endless loop on the propaganda channel, the faux news, one vowel movement away from what it did to the news. Unbelievable, right? I mean, the tapes are the tapes. But on Valentine's Day, Donald Trump was in the Oval Office with his advisors, and they were debating how do they explain that they have to get rid of Michael Flynn. Now, the only reason why it was February and not January, when Sally Yates had warned Don McGahn that Michael Flynn was blackmailable, is because they did not care. They didn't, of course, they knew what Michael Flynn was up to because they were doing it too. They were part of it. And by they, I mean Jared. I mean the president. I mean, all of them, Rick Gates and Tom Barrack and everybody around Trump knew what was going on because they were part of what was going on. They all had their different reasons for letting it go on, but they all needed money. They all wanted money. And they were going to change everything in the world to make it even more disgusting than it already is as far as the elite running everything. They felt like the elite always get, and now we are them and we're going to take. And this is what they've been up to. So in February, Flynn was still there, even though Sally Yates had warned them in January. But they let him stay there until it became public, until it was in the newspaper. And when it was in the newspaper that Flynn was subject to blackmail by the Russians, and that Flynn was, telling Mike Pence to just go out and lie, then all of a sudden they had to do something about Flynn because it was in the newspaper. And as much as, Donald Trump's going to complain, fake news, they knew it was real because they know what they're doing. They had consciousness of guilt because they were guilty. And so they decided, well, we got to dump Flynn. I don't know what we're going to do. But you know what? I'll say he lost my trust. I'll say that because he lied to my vice president, Mike Pence, which he didn't lie. He just told Mike Pence what to say on the TV. And that was that Mike Flynn had given him assurances that none of this was true. And Mike Pence goes out on the Sunday shows and says, none of this is true. There were no Russian contacts by anybody in the campaign. Michael Flynn told me that was not true. And of course, the Russians are giggling like schoolgirls going, yep, the whole administration is our bitch. They'll all cover for us. This is good. Then Paul Ryan decides, I don't know how Paul Ryan knew what was going on, but Trump, was talking to Paul Ryan in the Oval Office, and he said, why don't you just say that you asked Flynn to resign because he's lost your trust? Now, Sean Spicer was in that meeting, and Sean Spicer, as the president's press secretary, was just about to brief the news media about the decision on Flynn. And Trump said to Spicer, say that, meaning what Paul Ryan said. Say that. And according to, there's leaks from this meeting. So either this is coming from Paul Ryan or this is coming from Sean Spicer. I don't know who gave this story to Maggie Haberman and who gave this story to Mike Mazzetti, but this is the information they have. And so Trump said to Spicer, say that. And Spicer says, is it true? Is it true that you lost trust in Flynn and that, and he says, just say that I asked for his resignation. And Sean Spicer then leaves the Oval Office and goes to have a press briefing. And this is what he says.
The evolving and eroding level of trust as a result of this situation and a series of other questionable instances is what led the president to ask for General Flynn's resignation.
I guess he did it.
Immediately after the Department of Justice notified the White House counsel of the situation, the White House counsel briefed the president and a small group of his senior advisors. The White House counsel reviewed and determined that there is not an illegal issue, but rather a trust issue. During this process, it's important to note that the president did not have his attorney general, Jeff Sessions, who he trusts immensely, approved by the Senate. When the president heard the information as presented by White House counsel, he instinctively thought that General Flynn did not do anything wrong, and the White House counsel's review corroborated that.
McGahn.
It is not ordinary for an incoming national security advisor to speak with his counterparts about the issues of concern to them. In fact, he spoke with over 30 of his counterparts throughout the transition. As Charles Krauthammer said last night, it is, quote, perfectly reasonable for him to do so. The issue here was that the president got to the point where General Flynn's relationship misleading the vice president and others, or the possibility that he had forgotten critical details of this important conversation had created a critical mass and an unsustainable situation. That's why the president decided to ask for his resignation, and he got it.
So check this out. I mean, he invokes Don McGahn, and he says, he confabbed with Don McGahn, and Don McGahn said it's not a legal situation, it's a trust situation. All that's it's false. It's not true. And what was going on during that press briefing that we now know, thanks to Maggie Haberman and Mazzetti and all these reporters on the New York Times, is that when Spicer's briefing began that day after this Oval Office meeting, where Trump just says, go out and say it's a trust thing, it's not a legal thing, and that we ran it through all the legal, and everybody, including the White House counsel, who's supposed to protect the presidency from any law breaking, they all agree there's no legal issue here. The lawyers at DOJ, the lawyers across the intelligence community, the lawyers who knew, the people in the intelligence community and in the Justice Department who knew the truth, were listening to Sean Spicer lie. They heard so many misstatements there, and their concern was that Sean Spicer was saying that Flynn had been exhaustively investigated and that they had run it through to Don McGahn, and that they said this was patently, provably untrue because Sally Yates had already been to the White House and told Don McGahn 3 weeks earlier that Flynn was intercepted talking to the Russians and he's blackmailable because the Russians know what he said. And they now know the vice president is repeating these lies. And they now know you are repeating these lies. Then Sean Spicer goes out and repeats these lies. And so Spicer tells the New York Times that he stuck to talking points that he was given by the White House counsel's office, and that White House lawyers expressed concern only about how he had described the thoroughness of the internal inquiry into Flynn. But the lawyers over at FBI they wrote a memo. They were sitting there watching this. And they wrote a much longer memo, and they said, here are all the misstatements that Sean Spicer just said. They sent it to the White House. They said, his press briefing today was full of lies. And the White House never, ever publicly corrected the record. The White House never said, okay, we'll correct the record. And so we were left with this impression that the reason why Flynn was fired is because the president lost trust in him because he had lied to the vice president. When Sally Yates testified that she had told Don McGahn to the Senate understood what the lay of the land was. You know why? Because they'd already been briefed.
Ms. Yates, we've established in the course of these questions that on December 27th and 29th, former National Security Advisor General Flynn discussed sanctions with the Russian ambassador. So when the Trump transition team told the Washington Post on January 13th that sanctions were not discussed, was that false?
I understand that there have been news reports to that account, but I can't confirm whether, in fact, those conversations regarding sanctions occurred, because that would require me to reveal classified information.
Well, now we
Understood.
know.
So I have a whole series of questions about things that would have been untrue. Were that the case, you're not going to be able to answer any of those.
Not to the extent that it goes to General Flynn's underlying conduct. I can't address that.
Well, then let me move to that, if I might.
Sure.
On January 24th, you just testified that National Security Advisor Flynn was interviewed by the FBI about his underlying conduct, and that that underlying conduct was problematic because it led to the conclusion the vice president was relying on falsehoods. What was that underlying conduct, and are you convinced that the former National Security Advisor was truthful in his testimony to the FBI in January 24?
Again, I hate to frustrate you again, but I think we're going to have to, because my knowledge of his underlying conduct is based on classified information. And so I can't reveal what that underlying conduct is. It's why I had to do sort of an artificial description here of events without revealing that conduct.
I understand that. On January 27th, you just testified that you discussed with White House Counsel McGahn 4 different topics. And one of them included the possibility of criminal prosecution of the former National Security Advisor and what would the applicable statutes be. What applicable statutes did you discuss? And in your conclusion, should the National Security Advisor face criminal prosecution?
Senator Coons, I'm going to strike out here, because if I identify the statute, then that would be insight into what the conduct was. And look, I'm not trying to be hyper-technical here. I'm trying to be really careful that I observe my responsibilities to protect classified information. And so I can't identify the statute.
Okay. Do you believe the administration took your warnings seriously when you made this extraordinary effort to go to the White House and in-person brief the White House counsel on the 26th and 27th? Do you think they took appropriate steps with regards to General Flynn as the National Security Advisor, given that he remained a frequent participant in very high-level national security matters for 2 weeks?
Well, certainly in the course of the meetings, both on the 26th and 27th, Mr. McGahn certainly demonstrated that he understood that this was serious. So he did seem to be taking it seriously. I don't have any way of knowing what, if anything, they did. If nothing was done, then certainly that would be concerning.
So you don't know whether they took any steps to restrict his access to classified information, to investigate him further, up and until the Washington Post published information that made it clear that he had been lying to the vice president?
No, again, I was gone after the 30th, and so I wouldn't know if any steps had been communicated to the Department of Justice, but I was not aware of any, no.
Had you not been summarily fired, would you have recommended to the White House counsel that they begin further investigations into the National Security Advisor, or that they restrict his access to sensitive and classified information?
Well, it's a bit of a hypothetical. Had I remained at the Department of Justice, and if I were under the impression that nothing had been done, then yes, I would have raised it again with the White House.
So she's fired. The woman who warned the President of the United States that his National Security Advisor was blackmailable by the Russians can't tell us back when she's testifying what the underlying behavior is, which now we know was a transfer of nuclear technology to the Saudis via Russia, okay, that Russia was going to build these things and America was going to take the sanctions off Russia to free up their ability to do this kind of business in Saudi Arabia. That's the underlying behavior. That the White House kept him there, knowing. Don McGahn knew, because she told him. She told him twice. She told him on the 27th. She went back to the White House on the 29th. And he doesn't get fired until it hits the newspapers. And they have no choice. They send Sean Spicer out to lie about the reason why he was fired. And later that same day, that they're in the Oval Office telling Sean Spicer to go to the briefing and to lie to the American people about the reason Michael Flynn has been fired. And it's only after it's in the newspaper that they do something, even though they've allowed him, we think that they've allowed him to continue to take classified intelligence briefings for 2 more weeks. See, that's a question for Don McGahn. Did you allow him? And that's why Don McGahn has testified, but in private. We don't know what Don McGahn was asked or answered. But later that same day, that's when Donald Trump calls James Comey into the Oval Office and asks him to let Flynn go. That day, all this happened in one single day. Valentine's Day, 2017. It's unbelievable. So, late January, Sally Flynn's warning them. He's blackmailable. They're like, yeah, we know, because we are too. We are too. They send Spicer out to tell the American people a lie that Flynn was let go because he lied to Pence. That's bullcrap. He told Pence what to say on the TV. That's what happened. And then later that day, after he says that he asked Flynn to resign, he calls Comey in and says, let him go. Let him go. Go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.